are leaders in the world who are made for impact.
If we develop the habit in organizations of saying, it's your responsibility to ask for feedback. And if we ask more, you want feedback, ask for feedback. Because when you ask, it's like you set yourself up to listen.
Right.
Right?
Right.
And you may not love what you hear, but at least you're in a mindset where you can listen. And when we're called into our supervisor's office, we then have an amygdala brain set that causes us to not listen at all and get mad and sweat and all these other things. So asking for feedback is a great gift, and it's a lovely thing to do.
I'm Gretchen Schott, and this is Made for Impact, a show for leaders who want to leave a lasting impact on their organizations, their teams, and their lives.
My guest today is Joe Folkman. He is the co-founder and president of Zenger Folkman, a firm specializing in leadership and organizational development. He's a highly acclaimed keynote speaker at conferences and seminars all over the world. He's one of the nation's renowned psychometricians, and his extensive expertise focuses on change management. He has worked for and worked with prestigious and successful organizations such as AT&T, General Motors, Wells Fargo, and Yale University. Joe's research has been published in several publications, including the Harvard Business Review, the Wall Street Journal, and Forbes, which is where I stumbled into his work, as well as being the author or co-author of 9 books. He recently wrote a book called The Trifecta of Trust, which we dig into that. He's also a contributor to the podcast, The 90th Percentile, which is a great listen. This is a podcast today that you are going to want to get out a pencil and paper, or maybe save this and listen to it over and over again, because the tips that Joe gives us are phenomenal. You're going to love what he has to share. Take a listen. Joe, I'm so excited to have you on the show. I think I've been giddy all day, and I have been bragging about meeting you to so many people today. It's ridiculous.
You are too kind. Thank you.
But when I would tell people I'm meeting you, I said, so I'm talking to this gentleman. He is a psychometrician. And then they would say, what is that? So can you share a little bit with our listeners about the work that you do at Zenger Folkman and what a psychometrician is?
A psychometrician is a psychologist that measures things, and the thing I measure the most is leadership and employee engagement and those kinds of things. When my youngest was in grade school, he came up to me, Dad, one day, and he said, Dad, what do you do? And I said, I'm a psychometrician. And he said, okay. And he started walking off. And I said, why you ask? Today in school, we're going to talk about what our moms and dads do. So I'm going to tell him. And I said, good luck. So he goes to school. I go to work. That night I came home. I said, how'd it go at school? He said, good. Did you tell him what I do? He said, yeah, but I could only remember the first part. Psycho. So I wondered why the teacher looked at me funny that day. Anyway.
Yes. You're bringing your wife with you to the parent-teacher conference, yes?
My dad's a psycho.
Well, I can relate. My kids always ask me what I do, and then I don't know what they say sometimes. They're like, I just know you do stuff with leadership. Okay, that's great. Super.
That works.
Tell our folks a little bit about your business, Zenger Folkman.
So the firm is Zenger Folkman, and my partner, Jack Zenger. Jack's been around in HR and management field. He's 93. He's been around a long time, and he kind of runs me ragged, just got a lot of energy. We do leadership development, and a lot of the work that we do is around 360 surveys for leaders, and we've done them. I've done them for 40 years. And when I did them the first 25 years, I'd give people feedback and I'd say, figure out why you're such a loser. Because when you get that feedback report, your eyes automatically look for what's wrong with me, right? And I thought that was okay. But about 20 years ago, Jack and I got together, we looked at some data, and, we discovered that actually that was the wrong approach. We found that 80% of the time, people getting feedback would be better off focusing on what's right with them, what they could do well, rather than what they need to fix. Now, 20% of the time, people had what we call the fatal flaw. Terrible. They were doing something really bad. And in that case, it was the right thing to do to work on that negative thing. But 80% of the time, people are better off just finding something they're pretty good at it. And can you be great at something? And so we switched our approach to say, let's help people focus on their strengths and let's help people find their passion around. And you only had to be really good at 3 things to be a leader in the top 20% of leaders. And so 3 competencies gets you to the 81st percentile, and 5 got you to the 90th percent. So you don't have to be perfect, which when you think about leaders, great leaders are really good at a few things, but they're not great at everything, right?
Mm-hmm.
So
yeah. Well, and I think there's too much focus on trying to be great at everything. And that's why you have so many people that are struggling with perfectionism and imposter syndrome and doubting their self-worth and even doubting so much about their leadership because they're trying to be everything to everyone. And you're not made to be everything to everyone, right?
Oh, yeah. Just find that thing you got passion for. What can you do really well? That's your good thing, and do that.
What would you say are those competencies that you think most leaders should be striving to hone their skills in?
It's interesting. When we're growing up, what we learned from our parents was they gave a lot of orders. I remember when my daughters were young and I asked them, I said, what do leaders do? And they said, leaders give orders. They tell people what to do. They're the boss. And I said, where'd you get that? They said, from you.
Oh, no.
You're always telling us you're the boss. But that what we call drive for results. And that's been a cornerstone to most leadership for people, getting things done, telling people what to do, giving orders, giving direction. By the way, very important competency, very critical. So the opposite, so let's call that push. If you say, what's the opposite of push? It's pull. And what that competency is inspiring and motivating others. So we've gathered data, our data set is over 100,000 leaders. And if you look at the 100,000 leaders and you say, if you compare people on push and pull, 72% of leaders are better at pushing than pulling. Does that surprise you?
No, it doesn't. But yeah,
but only 22% are better at pulling than pushing. Okay. And if we look at the competencies and say, which competency comes in, where does drive for result comes in? It's the 4th highest in terms of skill. Where does inspiring and motivating others come in? Number 19 out of 19. It's dead last. But when we ask people which competency is most important to do well, to be successful in your current job, guess what's number 1?
Inspiring and motivating others. Mm-hmm.
And if you think about today in the situation we're in right now, and the young people, do they want to be driven?
Right. No.
Or do they want to be inspired? So really, that's an interesting dilemma for a lot of leaders is how do I become more inspiring? And most people have to scratch their head because it's a big question. But that's I think if you say what competency is lacking the most and requires a little bit of work to get better at it, it's inspiring. But I believe people can be better at it. And again, the most effective leaders, they do both. If you say, well, quit pushing and stop pulling, don't do that.
We need both. That's right.
Yeah. We need people say, you guys sent me an email and said, get on this call early. Mm-hmm. That was push. Oh, by the way, here's all the questions. You better read them. There was 2 pages of instructions. I'm still reading. But that's good. I needed that, right? Mm-hmm. And so I showed up for the meeting, and that's good. But then when you came on the call and you inspired me and you got me excited, oh, that was wonderful.
Oh, thank you.
So you're really a push and pull person.
Thank you. I think it depends on the person you speak to. My children would probably say I'm a pusher. They would like me to be more of a puller, but I'm okay with them thinking I'm a pusher right now.
Yeah, that they need that.
They need that. They need that. Let me go back to the 360s because I am a person that had horrible experience with 360s early in my career. And so I'll be honest, I'm a little embarrassed to tell you this, but I feel like I can tell you this as my friend now. Whenever somebody asks me to do a 360, I'm generally like, I don't know if that's right. And so I would love for you just to give our audience some context around times when you believe a 360 assessment is crucial and why, and when a 360 assessment maybe isn't the best tool at that time. I'm curious your thoughts on that.
So I was with a group at Yale a few months ago, and it was the medical side of the business. And I asked people, have you ever worked for a really bad leader?
Everybody, yes.
Every hand goes up. What was it like? Terrible, awful.
Awful, felt bad. They were mean, yes.
And I said, so you knew this leader was bad. Were you the only one? Oh, no. This is common knowledge. Did that leader know? They might have guessed they weren't great, but they did not know they were the worst leader I've ever worked for. So we have this interesting problem. And when we look at our data, we find that the worst person at predicting your strengths and weaknesses is you. Other people, and it doesn't matter which, manager, peers, direct reports, others people are 2 times better at predicting your strengths and weaknesses than you are. And this is the condition we all live in. We don't know what we stink at and what we're great at. We kind of know, we sort of have a clue, but we're really pretty dumb about it. And we found, and I've been doing this for too many years, that if you let people be anonymous, so they can't tell who said what, people are pretty good at giving you feedback. Now, what we found in our research is that it made an enormous difference in engagement of employees. If we look at the engagement of employees and you say, how do I determine who's going to be engaged and who's not going to be engaged? The one factor that will tell you the whole story is how effective is your leader? Because if you work for a bad leader, you have a disengaged, frustrated, angry employee. If you work for a great leader, you have a highly engaged, love their job, want to work some more. And we look at this, it is so clear, it's so dominant that if you work for a bad leader, engagement below the 20th percentile. If you work for a great leader, engagement is at the 80th percentile. And that poor engagement causes turnover, it causes a reduction in discretionary effort and all these other things. 360 can help because at least people can know what to do. Now, what we found was that for 80% of the people, the best thing they can do is to get that feedback and then find something they're pretty good at that they could be better at. And so our advice most of the time is to build a strength, is to become really good at 3 things. And if you can do that, boy, it makes a big difference. What's problem with 360 is most of the time it's this awful contest of looking at what's wrong with you, and that's all we're going to look at. And so it can be discouraging.
That my experience was we did it in a company that I worked for, and I was working in HR. So it was like my role to actually get everyone to do the process and comply, essentially. And it was so disruptive because the focus was on taking the feedback and finding something to improve. So it was definitely like, let's look at what you're really not doing well and then create plans around all the things you're not doing well. And as a result of that, the leaders missed the feedback that was affirming in what they were doing because they spent more time trying to figure out who said it versus is there any truth to that? Or even having the conversation of like, well, they may have said that, but do I believe that? Do I care? Is that something I want to get better at? It was so defensive. It created so much hostility within our culture. And I want to say that they did it like every 6 months. And so it was like such an uproar because we did it. It was like, oh, we finally are getting through. It's like, oh gosh, here we go again. So if you were advising someone that wanted to implement a 360, what would be the conditions in which you would say, like, these are the things that need to be in place for this to be successful?
Number one, the major focus is on your strengths. 20% of the time, people have what we call a fatal flaw. They're really bad at something. 360s point that out. And what we find is you don't need to turn that into a strength. You just need to get it out of the, you're horrible. Turn it into a weakness.
Right.
And then what can you do? Well, the process to be anonymous, to have that anonymous feedback, the timing, I'd advise PepsiCo, which is an interesting company. There's more CEOs that come out of PepsiCo than any other company. And you say, gee, what did that? Well, they do 360 feedback with their leaders every 2 years. And they actually have a discussion with their manager and their feedback. And so, it becomes part of that developmental experience. But, this whole idea that once people get used to that and they look at it as a developmental thing and a growth thing and not, we're going to help you grow, not we're going to judge you unfairly, it can be a really helpful process for people to kind of learn and grow and develop. Part of the problem we think that's problematic is the average age of people in the last 3 years that went through our 360 process, they were 46 years old. Okay. So people go to work at 22 or 20 or something like that, and they work for 20 years. And then we go, let's give you some feedback. And I think, gosh, giving people this observations of other people is a great thing to learn early in your career.
Absolutely.
They wait till they're in a leadership position and they're higher up in the organization. But as a way to kind of think about personal growth, this is just a great way to do it and a useful technique. And it can be, if you run it as we're going to focus on what's wrong with you, it could be a terrible thing. But if you run it as an opportunity for people to find and develop their strengths, it can be a really beneficial exercise, something that is exciting for people.
I like that. I want to talk a little bit about your new book, because I know you just have a new book that came out. You're author of many books, but the Trifecta of Trust. Can you share a little bit about what inspired you to write this book?
I call it my Manhattan Project.
Many aspiring authors are now saying, I am taking that and calling that my project right now.
So the atom bomb, right? If you think about the atom, it's this really small particle that has this enormous impact. So I looked for the smallest behavior with the largest impact. And as I looked through all the behaviors and tried to figure out which one has the biggest impact, it's trust. What's funny about trust is you don't need a degree in psychology to know who you trust and who you don't trust. This thing comes really early in a person's life. I mean, you can go talk to your grade school kid. Who do you trust? And people know, they're really clear about it. And, they don't understand all the intricacies of it, but they know trust, and they know when they don't have trust. We travel to different countries sometimes, and some countries we feel like, things are good here. And other countries, we kind of go, where's my wallet? So that research, there's something called the World Values Survey. They have in that survey, they go around the world and they ask one question in there: can most people be trusted, or do you have to be careful? Now, what's interesting about it is they look at that question and the percentage of people that say, yes, most people can be trusted. And in Norway, about 70% of the population say yes. So that's pretty good. And then in the United States, about 42% say, yes, most people can be trusted. And in Colombia, 10% say, yes, most people can be trusted. And if you look at the GDP for those three places, you'll find this interesting correlation. The correlation between GDP and that question is 0.83, which is an incredibly high correlation. You can predict the gross domestic product, the wealth or poverty of a nation based on that question. Can most people be trusted? Because every transaction requires some level of trust. So in some countries, you have to be very careful. And in other countries, you do things quite quickly. And it's interesting. So basically what I found is the older I get, the more simple-minded I become. Don't tell me about 14 variables, right? So what really helps a person be trusted? 3 things. Number 1, relationships. If we like people, we trust them. Gretchen, I don't know you very well at all, but you're such a fun person and I trust you.
Well, good. I hope so.
But I kind of like you, you know?
Yeah. Thank you.
So relationships are critical. And if you're having trust problems with somebody, start there. Number 2 is consistency. And usually, you know, I say what I do what I say. If I'm saying I'm going to do it, I'm going to do it. And I thought that was the major cause of lack of trust, is that we're inconsistent. We don't follow through. We don't do what we say we're going to do. The third thing that really levers up trust is expertise, good judgment. I went to the doctor last year. Doctor said, you need to start doing something. I came home. I talked to my wife. Said, I'm going to start doing this. Why? The doctor told me. She said, I've been telling you that for years. Well, you know, he's got a white coat on.
And so that makes all the difference. Yeah.
It's just funny. It's okay, I'll do it now. But as you think about it with leaders, do they know their job? Do they really understand it? A lot of people think they can fake it till they make it. I mean, it just doesn't work. So one of the things that helps is if you're not the expert, then find an expert. That actually gives you trust because you were smart enough to bring in somebody that knew what they were doing. Those 3 factors really can account for 80% of the variability in trust. But what we found that's interesting is, you know, if you said, well, I'll do one of those, I'll be good at relationships. You really need to say, I need to be reasonably good. And what we found is that if you didn't need to be great, but if you were at the 60th percentile on all 3 of those, so 10 points above average, not great, but just 10 points above average, trust was at the 80th percentile.
Wow. I really like that because I think when I would talk about trust in leadership classes that I would teach, I often gave like the example with my kids about trust. And I was notorious for being that mom that was just 5 minutes late picking them up because I was checking that one more email. I was just finishing up that one more note. And then I was out the door and I was racing like crazy. And I would share that I would break trust with my kids because I was consistently inconsistent in showing up on time to pick them up. And I was continually putting work and what was happening at work over my obligation or my commitment that I made to them. Yes, I'm going to be there at 4:00 to pick you up for that club meeting. And I'd be the mom that was there at like 4:05. Mine would be the last kids to get picked up. And I'm coming in like my minivan's burning hot. And I'm like, jump in. And I'm taking a call. So what I taught my children was that they could trust that I was going to be late. And that was not good. They could consistently know I was going to be inconsistent in when I showed up and how I showed up.
But you never left them.
But I never left them. I was always late, but I never forgot them. Right.
Yeah.
Which probably doesn't show good judgment on my ability to drive or manage my time. But that's probably a conversation for another time.
That was it. That's interesting. But they did. They trusted you to be there. Mm-hmm. I have a daughter, and we were on a family trip once, and we stopped at this gas station late at night. My daughter did not get back in the car, and we were driving down the road. Where's Rachel?
Oh my gosh.
She, to this day, still is like, you left me.
Oh.
We're still making up for that.
Yes. Well, Joe, you told me 2 things. You left your child and you don't listen to your wife. Now, we need to talk about your relationships with the women in your life, I think.
All true. All true.
Well, let's talk about this idea of the trifecta of trust and a little bit more with like teams and leadership. So how do you think leaders can effectively navigate and address conflicts between team members with different styles of communication and maybe even different variances of trust?
I got really interested in this question last night. So I looked at my data.
I love it.
So I looked at trust and the ability to manage conflicts, right? One of the things that we can measure that kind of really are a reflection of low trust, high conflict is turnover. And so here's what I found. If you have low trust and low conflict resolution, right? So two bad things. The percentage of your direct reports that are thinking about quitting is 44%. So 44% of the employees are thinking, I'm out of here. That's not good.
Well, let me just pause there for a second. So low trust and low conflict resolution, that can show up in ways on teams saying, oh, we don't really have a lot of conflict because there's false harmony. Would you say that when there's false harmony, there's actually low trust?
Well, yeah. And there's sort of different sides of the same coin. Because when you have conflict in a team, everybody's walking on eggshells. It's uncomfortable. You're always tentative about if I say something, it's going to be like, and a lot of managers get a low score on resolving conflict with others. And when I talk to them about it, they say, no, it's their problem. Two direct reports, they can't get along with each other. They need to resolve it. I'm going to tell them to resolve it. They're not creating the problem. It's other people, and they don't feel responsible to resolve conflict. And it affects everybody. It affects the whole team. And, if there's one message I would like to say, it's like, if there's conflict, it's your problem. Because it affects them, it affects you, it affects everybody. So being responsible for that is critical. So here's what I did, though. I looked at the bottom quartile, and 44% are leaving if you're bad on both. So what would happen if you had low trust, if you didn't have trust, but you were really pretty good on resolving conflict? 31% of your employees want to quit. That's not that much. It's 44, but then it goes down to 31. Well, wonder if you had high trust, but low conflict. Oh, that's 30% of the employees want to. So it's really interesting that both of these things are like they're different issues, but the effect is just the same if you're bad at one of them and good at the other one, which is kind of funny. And what was really interesting was the low trust, high conflict. I only had 500 cases of that. I was looking at 15,000 leaders, so only had 500 who were in that category. But when I went to the high trust, low conflict, there was 1,000. There was twice as many cases of that. But again, 30%. Now, if you have high trust, high conflict, only 15% of the employees are thinking about quitting. They're two sides of the same coin, and resolving conflict, I think it's just critical. It has to be your problem, and there's some things that you need to do to help people resolve conflict.
Can you share in your experience and having worked with so many different teams and such diverse kinds of groups? Because I think that leaders talk about skills and they say, well, I need to improve my conflict resolution skills. But what would you say are actually like skills underneath that people need to sharpen or pay attention to? Or maybe it's even behaviors that you think leaders need to be adopting or some kind of competency around that.
So one of the things that we discovered early on in our research with Jack was sometimes when you're good at one thing, people assume you're good at other things. It's lovely, it's like, oh, you're really good at that. That means you're good at this, right? And so when you say to people, get out there and resolve conflict, it's like, okay, what do I do?
Mm-hmm. You're a good speaker. You should talk about this.
Yeah. So one of the things that we have is, and we learned this a little bit from AI, but if you have enough data, you can figure out a lot of things. So we have a lot of data about leaders and about the interactions between various skills and behaviors. So I went into my database. I'm looking at 100,000 leaders. And basically, here's what I found were behaviors that help a person resolve conflict. You're not going to be surprised by the number one. One was build relationships, right? part of conflict comes because people don't like you or they feel you don't like them. Or if you can work on the relationship, that helps. Number 2 was communication. And when people say, what can I do to communicate better with people? We keep finding the number 1 way to improve your communications is to shut up and stop talking and start listening. It's like, how do I improve my communications? By shutting up and listening.
Listen. Yes. I know. I wanted to blurt listening, but you were talking. So I was not listening. Yeah.
It's the magic. It's so crazy. It's like, well, I want to, I give a better speech, say it more powerfully, blah, blah, blah. No, shut up. It's the listening part. It's such a powerful behavior. But the third one's kind of fun. And if you do employee surveys, and you've done a lot of these, and if you'd say, what is on the top of the list on employee surveys that people want? And usually one of the things on the top of the list is they want to develop. They want to learn new skills. They want to develop new skills. We know this. And so a great way to help resolve conflict is to invest or to try and develop skills in others and help them develop new skills. And that's a secret, great way to do it. The fourth way is valuing diversity and differences. This is kind of a new competency. It's sort of hard to believe. 10 years ago, we never cared.
I know. It's embarrassing, right?
Yeah. It's like we didn't talk about this 10 years ago. We didn't,
Yeah, valuing difference wasn't something that was even really discussed. It was over-indexing on relationship. It was talking about saying the right things, but it wasn't about the richness that comes from a different point of view or a different way of looking at something.
And boy, that is skill. And I have to say that being a white male, there's so many times where I'm clueless. It's just, if you're male or white or whatever, you better believe that you're probably not great at this.
Yeah.
Because we found when we measured it that the damage, people would rate themselves at the 43rd percentile, so they little bit below average. Other people were rating them at the 25th percentile on valuing diversity. So a lot of people just don't get the fact, and they don't get what they're doing. And I admit to being clueless too often.
Yeah. Well, when you're in the majority, it's hard to recognize anything that's not your world.
Yeah, it is. And to be humble about that and say, look, I'm probably going to mess up here and please tell me.
Mm-hmm. Building trust to invite that kind of feedback in, to invite that kind of humble me. It's okay. I want to learn, to that point of I want to be better. I want to grow. I think that part of it too is people don't always invite that feedback. But
the fifth thing I found there was a nice little habit that we could all do better, and that's asking for feedback. What's interesting, if you think about, Gretchen, what would really help in an organization, it's so crazy because if you ask a manager or supervisor, what's the worst, the hardest, the stupidest thing you have to do is give a performance review.
Nobody says to me, oh, please, can I go do that? I can't wait to do that. That has never, ever been said to me in all my years.
It is the worst. And it's usually confrontational. And the research suggests that a high percentage of the time when feedback is given, it does more damage than good. Mm-hmm. But the one thing that's interesting is if we develop the habit in organizations of saying, it's your responsibility to ask for feedback. And if we ask more, you want feedback, ask for feedback. Because when you ask, it's like you set yourself up to listen. And you may not love what you hear, but at least you're in a mindset where you can listen. And when we're called into our supervisor's office, we then have an amygdala brain set that causes us to not listen at all and get mad and sweat and all these other things. So asking for feedback is a great gift, and it's a lovely thing to do.
Joe, I could keep talking to you. You've given us so many great tools and tips already. if someone was listening to the show and they wanted to get connected with you, or they want to do a 360 now that they've heard you talk about it, what's the best way for somebody to get connected with you?
Thanks for asking. You can go to zengerfolkman.com, and that's our web address. And another thing you can do is look on HBR. We have a blog there. Zenger Folkman has a blog on HBR that you'll see articles.
Harvard Business Review, for folks that may not know the acronym. Yeah.
And then Forbes blogs. We also have a podcast called The 90th Percentile with my lovely daughter. So
it's so good. I love it. And they're short. For those listening, it's like a 10, 15 minute. It's so helpful. That idea of how do you get into that top 90th percentile, but your wisdom just like you got like bullets, like nuggets. I love it. So I recommend you guys check out his podcast.
You're so kind, Gretchen. Thank you.
Thank you, Joe, for being here. We really appreciate everything you've shared. And I know I'm going to have you back now for something else.
Uh-oh. Well, this has been delightful. You're amazing. You do a great job. And thank you so much for the opportunity.
You're welcome. Oh my goodness, you guys, what a great interview. I loved so many things that he said. I've got a page full of notes. I loved what he talked about, these pushing and pulling behaviors. 72% of our behaviors are driving results, or 72% of managers do that. And those things that inspire others. I love what he said about the things we need to do for trust. But the one thing that I'm definitely taking away, and I hope that you are too, are those 5 behaviors that he shared about building that skill around conflict resolution, building relationships, working on how you're building relationships, thinking about listening and communication, developing skills in others as a way to think about the value of getting into a conflict and trying to resolve it. How are you developing a skill in yourself, or how are you developing skills in others as a means of that conflict resolution? I loved that. Understanding the valuing of differences, as well as asking for feedback. So many good nuggets. He's so smart. We're going to have him back another time and talk about more things. But I hope that you got lots and lots of good things that you can use in your day-to-day life, in your relationships with your family, with your friends, with your community, and that this helped you in your leadership. Are you receiving my monthly newsletter? Be sure that you sign up and get insights and recommendations on leadership and development. I send it monthly. I promise it doesn't spam you. It's always good stuff, and you're going to want to get that. And are you loving the show? Because if you are, would you show us a little bit of love? I'm looking to get some stars and some reviews so I can get more people listening to the show. If you liked it, please share the show with others. Put it on your socials. If you have speakers that you think I should be talking to, please shoot me a note, comment on LinkedIn, send me a message. I would love to hear from you. I'd love to know what's making an impact on your leadership. I'd love to know what you are most interested in. But most importantly, I want you to remember that you are made for impact.